All right, we're live. Welcome to Beyond the Fundamentals. So in this session, by the way, welcome back, everyone who is here. And as some people have called it in our panel, some people have reached out to me. Excuse me. Let me get this out of the way right off the bat. Good way to start. Some people have reached out to me, and apparently there's somebody in the comments section of the channel who has spoofed my icon and my username, and they're making all kinds of comments that I would not make. And when I go to look for them under the video where it says they are in YouTube Studio, I can't find them. And I don't know why. So I don't think I've been hacked. It looks like I've been spoofed. So that's just a little administrative thing on the side. So if somebody could tag the real me underneath one of those fake ones, I can go make that person go away. I'd appreciate that. Now, today we're going to have a little discussion just about growth. So, and I thought it might be good to have a discussion about some of the most recent content that we've had. And I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of that content. Let me arrange some of my slides real quick so that I can see what I want to present. Most recently, we did a video called Chrysalis or Crypt. And the idea here is that each person, let me get rid of that thing. It always wants to put this doc right in the middle of what I'm trying to share. Each person is kind of analogous to a caterpillar, and what I'm calling what you could call first and second half of life wisdom. I'm saying that takes place kind of like a butterfly comes out of a cocoon. So you start off as a baby. Right around age 4 or 5, you start to grow your ego. And according to Ian McGilchrist, you're in your right hemisphere up through like age 4. And then you start getting enculturated, and you start building that left hemisphere representation of the world. And so that's what Richard Rohr would call a container. And so all of the stuff that you think is you, it gets put into that container, that ego. And some of that stuff might be like your name, your thoughts, your past or future actions, your emotions, your body, your preferences, desires, beliefs, your in-group affiliations, your familiar affiliations, successes, failures, your job, your position, your function, your utilitarian value, your traditions, your boundaries, your customs, your authority, your morality, security, impulse control, structure, and order. And those things are necessary, and they are good, just as a cocoon is necessary and good in order for a caterpillar to successfully turn into a butterfly. But the point isn't the cocoon. The point is what's inside. So we build the container with the importance of what's inside. But what happens in our left hemisphere dominant society, and I'm using left hemisphere and first half of life consciousness, first half of life wisdom, to be kind of analogous here, for just to be in shorthand. But what happens is we use all these other things like our position, our functions, our job, our reputation, and we wind up decorating our cocoon and continually doing repair work on our cocoon rather than emerging from it as the butterfly that we should be, the real us that was there all the time. And that there should be a shell that we kind of walk out of. And we also talked about how in periods of history where the left hemisphere is more dominant, there are more people that kind of miscarry in the cocoon, that fail to launch, that fail to come out and become Pinocchio never really turns into a real boy. And so I'm going to share a couple of other slides, some other things that we have talked about on the channel so far. We've mentioned spiral dynamics and integral theory. And so if you hear me use things like second tier consciousness is kind of like from here up, or on this chart from about here down or so. And then there's first tier consciousness, which would be like first half of life wisdom, or in terms of Fowler's stages of faith, it would be like the first 3 stages of faith. would be your first tier consciousness. Let me do that. So like your first tier consciousness would be like your first 3 stages of faith down here. And then your second tier consciousness is really stages 5 and 6, and your stage 4 is kind of a transitional period where you're coming out of the cocoon and trying to figure out what the new world is, that sort of thing. We had, back when we did the Tyler DeVela video, we compared a bunch of things left and right, early, late, first half of life wisdom, second half of life wisdom, when it comes to discernment, ego, attachment, perspectival capacity, symbols, rituals, capacity for meaning, connectedness, brain hemisphere, the kinds of knowing, relevance, realization, and what it might look like if somebody's opportunity to hatch from their cocoon kind of aborts in progress. We also talked about in videos, the enculturation process. On the left-hand side is kind of what it probably looked like for Paul. On the right-hand side is kind of what it looks like for us. But regardless of what it looks like, this is essentially the schoolmaster that's designed to bring us to Christ, that's designed to get us to wake up and exit the cocoon. And your Mammon church experience, as we've talked about many times, is a necessary container, like a cocoon, to get you to a certain place, at which point, like a space shuttle sheds its booster rockets, you could not have gotten to that height without them, but you cannot go further with them. It's like once you cross the river, leave the raft behind and then enjoy the shore, that kind of thing. And people can't enjoy the shore, they stay fixated with the raft. And then we had another chart that we talked about where as the increase in life suffering continues, there has to come a point in time where there's a realization that the current paradigm, the current way of thinking, is no longer sufficient to ameliorate the suffering that you're going through or to make it acceptable. And like Jordan Peterson says, when you go through pain, one thing you may realize is that pain is perhaps the only thing that you for sure know is absolutely real. And from there on, the only thing that is real to you is something that adequately addresses that pain, either by ameliorating it or by making it acceptable. And making it acceptable would be maybe a Viktor Frankl type of approach. And then there's a movement onto a more excellent way where you can abide in in charity and be in attunement with the logos, have some transformation, that sort of thing. So as a refresher, these are some of the things that we've talked about in some of the recent videos. And that's where we are right now. One of the reasons I have a passion for this is because, and I'll bring one slide right back up here. Sorry for playing the yo-yo game with you. But one of the reasons I have a passion for this is because once Christians have exhausted kind of what the church has to offer, that's taking them to the extent of stage 3 or first tier consciousness or first half of life wisdom, they can build an amazing cocoon. And remember, the cocoon isn't bad. It's a container that contains the real self, but what's inside is what matters. Well, the second half of life is where you discover that what it contains. That's where you discover what matters. But there are no, or very few, there are rarely or few affordances in the typical institutional church that allow a person to kind of map out where they go when they're sitting in church and they're like, isn't there anything deeper? Isn't there anything more than this? Is this all there is? Is there nothing beyond this? Is there no meaning beyond this? And also they find themselves in their life facing some kind of problem that they were not prepared to handle in the way that they think it should be handled. Like I should have been able to keep my marriage together, but was unable to. I should have been able to raise my kid to be at least this successful, but was unable to. You know, what failed, and then you go back and you start to relook at things. Well, when someone gets to that point, there's really not much there offered by the institutional church. Now, since we're in a meaning crisis, and the meaning crisis is characterized by left hemisphere dominance, I'm in Ian McGilchrist's book right now, and he's comparing left hemisphere dominance with schizophrenia and autism, and basically the degree to which an entire society is left hemisphere dominant. You have an entire society that is basically schizophrenic and autistic. And one thing that characterizes schizophrenic people is they're extremely paranoid. And so the problem with that is that as people reach the end of stage 3 and they're ready to try to hatch out of their cocoon and venture into, second half of life wisdom, everything is already the devil. Every avenue that they might possibly go and explore so that they can grow, their paranoia has already labeled it as something bad and evil. It's the monster that's going to get the child in the dark. It's the monster hiding in the kid's closet, that everything is bad. So not only has no one paved the road for where to go when you reach the end of first half of life wisdom that the church has to offer, but it's also further characterized, that problem is exacerbated by the fact that they characterize it by evil, and they think you're going into new age or something else, or the Kundalini spirit. They have something evil to map. Every possible endeavor of exploration has already been pre-mapped to something bad, so that you're kind of stuck. And one of the examples I used recently was, if you ever watched a movie where your hero is running from a bad guy or something, and they're running through the woods, then suddenly they emerge from the woods and they're on the edge of this super high cliff, and there's nowhere to go. And that's kind of what it feels like, where the person, you are kind of running from the mistakes of your past, and you're at the edge of what the institutional church and the culture have to offer, and there's nowhere to go. Well, what do we do now? And so what I'm trying to do is put the airplane together while it's flying, is try to make somewhat of a scaffolding whereby people might envision where they can go from here. All right, that's my intro, and that's that's a little bit of review over what we've covered. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts or comments on any of this stuff as you've seen it in the videos or as you've heard it here now.
So I'd like to take a little bit of a bite size off of some of that, kind of like scale it down a little bit. Because we haven't had a group discussion in quite some time, at least in the new year. And nevertheless, the channel has still been pretty active on the forefront, kind of like traversing forward a little bit. So there's kind of like a lot of content to obviously from the intro, a lot of content to springboard off of. So one of the things that kind of stood out to me was that I heard as a thread through that whole thing was, I like the analogy of the transformation and metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a cocoon, into a butterfly. I like that, especially as a good, natural, real-time phenomenon of transformation and stages of transformation. And so the aspect of that which stood out to me was the cocoon stage, and how that was analogous to the cocoon effect, or the sheltering effect that typical Christian, especially fundamentalist Christian growth kind of erects or construes. And I think one of the things that you mentioned was that there's nothing wrong with the cocoon. The cocoon isn't bad. It's in the pattern in the pattern of this whole analogy, it's necessary.
Right.
However, with what I observe with fundamentalist Christianity, I think that it's important to distinguish, or to make this distinction, that no, the notion of a cocoon isn't bad.
Right.
Right. It is necessary. However, when you apply
Some
the
particular
analogy,
cocoons might be an Iron Maiden.
exactly, that's a good analogy, is that the fundamentalist rendition of the cocoon does actually have mechanisms inside of it while the caterpillar is baking or whatever, does have mechanisms inside of it that start to train the individual that these things are evil, these things are good, and these are all like kind of sort of unwise and like short-sighted, very, very, very short-sighted narratives and value structures, which end up deeply, deeply hindering the capacity of the individual when they do, in process of time, come out of the cocoon.
It's
And
almost like there's anti-hatch built into some cocoons.
right. And exactly. So the notion of the cocoon isn't bad, but there are particular social structures or social programs like fundamentalist Christianity, which, like, the contents of that cocoon and how it functions, how it actually generates a person, or at least tries to generate a full and free person. So you'll hear people quoting, John 8 constantly, that you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. So Christians are all big on their freedom and stuff like that. And it tends to be a little bit ironic, and hence that thing you shared with me today, Kevin, with JD Martin.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's so deeply ironic. It's almost painfully ironic. So the notion of, a butterfly symbolizes a couple things, but at least one of those things, or a couple of those things, is, freedom for sure, and transformation or metamorphosis into something more beautiful. And Christians do prize themselves as the ones who are freed from something, and it does kind of, I think it does need to be pointed out.
Well, yeah, I think if there was some way to have stages 1 through 3 that were not rivalrous, that were not antagonistic, that were not witch hunt prone, like you don't have 8th graders in rivalry against college students. They consider that to be a natural progression. They're not against that. And so you could look at high school as a container from which will hatch plumbers and car mechanics and engineers and Nobel winning, nuclear physicists. All of those things can correctly hatch from the container of high school, and it will have served them well. It doesn't always produce the same thing in everybody, but also the nuclear physicist doesn't hate the plumber and doesn't think he's evil. He actually calls him over to his house to fix the plumbing. And the plumber doesn't hate the nuclear physicist. He actually patronizes his power plant. They're not enemies. They're friends in a symbiotic relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And another analogy that occurred to me is like, one thing a container is supposed to do, if you think of martial arts as you're advancing through the belts, as you're going from white belt to black belt, you'll notice that it's all about the rules, all about the rules, all about the rules. But by time you're Jackie Chan, now you're using chairs and things as weapons, but you weren't taught that in class. But also in class, you weren't taught that that's evil, but you have to learn the rules first so that you know how to properly break them. And, by the time you're Bruce Lee, by the time you're the master at what you're doing, you can creatively break the rules you learned when progressing through the belts, which is the point. The point of graduating is to know when and what you can manipulate and adjust without having to follow the rules. You're no longer subject to the rules at some point. There has to come a point, that point where I'm no longer bound by the rules of high school. I'm no longer bound by the rules of the brown belt. Now I can read the situation, and if I need to use a chair to take out the bad guy, imagine if they said you can only be in a fight if you use these techniques or have properly pre-identified weapons such as a bow staff or a sai or a katana blade or nunchucks, but you can't use a chair or a table.
Yeah.
What if using a chair or a table was deemed as evil? They would limit your creative capacity, and it was that kind of thing. Is so if we had a first half of life wisdom that was not rivalrous, antagonistic, and paranoid, I think that would be more ideal. And the fact that we have that stage 3 version of Christianity, which has built-in paranoia and rivalry, is a problem. But anyway, I think that what you were saying kind of prompted me to say that. I don't know if that's along the lines of what you were kind of getting at. That yes, a cocoon is necessary, but we're producing faulty cocoons these days.
Exactly.
From which people never hatch.
Yeah.
They just continue to decorate their cocoon for the rest of their life.
And even if they do hatch, they kind of come out as like this malformed butterfly, like without wings or something,
some kind of mutant.
Yeah
Something that's gone through some kind of metamorphosis but maybe can't fly, or maybe can't pollinate,
or can't explore.
Speaking of exploring, I hate to dominate this and talk the whole time, but because I did this video, Paula was like, we got to watch the movie Cocoon. I don't know if y'all seen the movie Cocoon from 1985 with the oatmeal Pepperidge Farm dude and the Quaker oatmeal guy.
Don Amici?
No, I forget his name.
Wilford Brimley.
Yeah, Wilford Brimley. That's right. That's exactly right. And there's a quote in there. One of the guys says, young men, even old men, were made to explore. And he just says this. And then that very night, I was listening to Richard Rohr and Falling Upward as I'm doing like my outdoor walk for like 45 minutes. And that turned out that he quoted the same thing. And it's a quotation from T.S. Eliot. Men, even old men, are made to explore, something like that. I forget the exact quote, but something like that. And I had no idea that it was a T.S. Eliot quote. But it's weird how those coincidences happen where you hear something, like you learn a new word and then you see it in 3 different places within the next 2 days. That same kind of thing happened, but it was with a quote. That's interesting. Anyway, I didn't mean to dominate.
I think I'm not going to say this well. One of the frustrations that I'm having right now is that there is so much out there that I want to explore and learn. But I'm, in a sense, made to feel that if I do that, I'm going outside the bounds of Scripture and going into areas that I shouldn't go. For the very reasons I think that you said earlier, it's deemed evil. But those people have never been there. How do they know? And
That's a good point.
if I'm discerning, and if I'm wise, and if I tread with some modicum of intelligence, I should be able to navigate that. Because we are told to seek wisdom and to seek knowledge. And that's very frustrating because there is so much out there, and it is overwhelming. And then not to feel free to really go out there without being considered, not a very good Christian. That's hard for me.
Well, one thought occurs to me, we can go, when we correct, there can be somebody learning to drive a car and they get in the left ditch and they correct, and then they're in the right ditch, So too many things that are not necessarily evil in and of themselves can be, corrected, those were not evil. But there are some things that are evil. Like if you say, well, I want to be happier and I don't like my neighbor, so I just want to go kill them. I mean, that is evil, I would think, so that's one thought. You don't want to, to go to the opposite extreme in correcting for one problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So,
But a tool is a tool and can be handled well or badly. And hopefully, you know the difference.
But yeah, so there is a time to kill.
Yes.
And I think that's part of second half of life wisdom, is where I trust that Roberta will come across situations for which I cannot pre-codify or prescribe any type of response because they're so unpredictable. But if she is prepared with the amount of wisdom that she needs from the first half of life, then I don't need to give her a codified moral code or moral structure. She will have the wisdom to address it appropriately as she goes.
Right. I have a thought about a codified moral structure.
Yeah.
That I was thinking about sharing, but I wanted to make sure I had it all organized, so I wrote up a little summary of it just a few minutes ago.
That's interesting.
And it, so if you can bear with me, I could try to share it.
You want to put it on the screen?
No, but if you think I'm totally off base or this is nonsense, please feel free to interrupt me. But
okay,
here it goes. Okay, but seeking a way to please God, or the moral structure, or what is the right thing for me to do? What does God want me to do? Or what's the right interpretation of the scripture? Calvinism, Arminian, open theism, Molinism, you name it. In seeking that I see a possible relation to the philosophical concept of perfection, like in classical theism, that God is perfect and therefore God never changes. Okay, so but that's God. But then there could be God's creation, and that's where I see something similar in the sovereignty that Calvinism proclaims, or at least some versions of Calvinism, that everything that happens is perfect, or Molinism, that whatever happens is the most perfect possible world, but we think that there's something that we're supposed to do that's perfect, that's just right, and we try to find that, and it seems like we build a box like a cocoon and put ourselves into it, and then we don't like it. We get claustrophobic because we create constraints on ourselves that are imaginary, like, because it seems to me, now this is where you guys have to watch me and pull me back if I get into heresy here. But
Heresy is a requirement here.
but anyway, it seems that that instead of God, instead of us trying to find what God wants us to do, maybe God is wanting to hear from us what we want, because I see evidence that there's not just one perfect thing that God wants people to do. In some biblical examples, like when Samuel anointed Saul king of Israel, Samuel told Saul, go do this. And then after you do that, do whatever you want to. So there's some things that God may want people to do, but then after that, it's up to you. And I see other examples like in Zechariah chapter 3. Zechariah saw Joshua the high priest and the angel of the Lord stood by. Joshua was in filthy garments. And anyway, and the Lord gave a change of garments to Joshua. But Zechariah told God what to do there. Give him a baseball cap. Okay, it was a turban, okay, a mitre, whatever. And instead of the rebuke, I decide that I am sovereign. No, God did it. You know what I mean? And when Isaiah, saw God, the year King Uzziah died, and the voice said, who shall I send? Isaiah said, send me. And apparently, okay, I'll take you up on it. And then, when Micah was prophesying to a king about a battle, God was saying, who will deceive him to some heavenly host, like Michael Heiser would maybe talk about, maybe not. But, God took a suggestion from them and said, okay. One of them said, I'll be a lying spirit. God said, okay. You know what I mean? And so Moses told God what to do. God was going to destroy Israel. And Moses said, no, don't do that. And Ezekiel said, yep, Moses talked God out of it. So it seems that people can be trying to find something that does not exist.
Like God wants the feedback of his people. And that last statement you made, I didn't mean to cut you off. I guess I did, but like people are looking for something that does not exist. Yeah. If you think about why humans create artificial intelligence, it's because we're interested in how it will assess things.
Yeah, and we're not interested in, typing what we want the artificial intelligence to say and push a button in it and it parrots exactly.
We don't want to program it. We want it to actually have machine learning. We want it to see things that we can't see. Now, if we start talking about God that way, people will think it's blasphemous right away, but it absolutely makes sense that creation would be a means of discovery rather than a means of dictatorialism or something, rather than just a means of expression.
Yeah, and I see this as leading to frustration and, problems, possibly, it seems, possibly psychological problems, depression, from not being able to find something that doesn't even exist and so forth.
It would seem to me that if God did not want us to be creative and to explore and to have fun with his creation, he would have just given us all knowledge right from the start, and then we could have gone about his business and not worried about what we wanted to do. I just don't view God that way, and that may be really wrong on my part, but I really think that that's part of why we don't know a lot more than we do, because we're geared for that excitement and that exploration and to see what's out there and to be awed by what he's done. And
yeah, the Old Testament record is a record of push and pull. There are commands to get up and go get out of your father's house, but then there are there are negotiations, there's give and take, there's two-sided covenants. That's very interesting.
And the Bible, especially the New Testament, talks a lot about liberty, where there's liberty, where the Spirit of the Lord is, as opposed to bondage, and
Yeah.
and a lot of the seeking, it seems that we, the human race in general, or people, they're seeking, they're creating a sort of bondage for themselves, in a sense.
That's very well said. Who were taken captive by the devil at his will. You can create it for yourself. I've been thinking, I've thought for a while that resentment is a representation of Satan in the cosmos of the mind. But I also thought, and I'm going to be accused of Mormonism for this, but that's not where I'm going with it. But this thought occurred to me too, is that Christ is that which was from old, from everlasting, Micah 5:2. So there, what we call the pre-incarnate Christ goes back to forever and goes into forever. Jesus of Nazareth is the particular. He's the apprehendable version of Christ that we can conceive of more easily, and that we can conceive of interfacing with. And Jesus is the mediator between God and man. And I'm also learning that the left hemisphere of the brain is the mediator, like a staging area between the world and the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere dispatches the left hemisphere to apprehend the world, and the left hemisphere, if doing what it's supposed to, apprehends the world, packages up, passes what it learned back to the right hemisphere, and then the right hemisphere adds that into the overall context that it perceives, the gestalt. It takes all the component parts from the left hemisphere and helps reform the gestalt. And so you need both of them working in tandem. And the thought occurred to me that Lucifer, Satan, is kind of like a left hemisphere that has usurped its authority over the right hemisphere. And Jesus is an example of the left hemisphere, the particular, that is in alignment with the Father, is in alignment with the right hemisphere, and is in the proper emissary role. And there are certain things the right hemisphere knows that the left hemisphere doesn't know, like context. And Jesus says things like, I don't know, the angels in heaven don't know, only the Father which is in heaven knows that, that kind of thing. It's like the left hemisphere, that Jesus of Nazareth as Christ knows what he is dispatched to know. And there's like the corpus callosum is more preventive, like the connection between the two hemispheres of the brain. It is more inhibitory than it is facilitating. In other words, it stops more stuff than it starts. And so Jesus, as the particular, only has the information that he needs to know. And then he feeds back to the Father. And then it's interesting. Yeah, rookie heretics. It's interesting to me that perhaps Jesus is a picture of the left hemisphere in improper ratio to the right hemisphere, whereas Lucifer is a picture of the left hemisphere gone amok.
That's a really, really, really great and thorough articulation of how I've been visualizing the narrative structure of Ian McGilchrist's notion of the master and his emissary, and how I've analogued that into the Christian narrative. I see Jesus as the properly oriented emissary who is in consistent, proper relationship to the master. Like exactly how you said it.
So you've been thinking the same thing.
It just so much that the articulation you just put out was like almost thoroughly to the point. Like the part that really stood out to me was that it's almost like left hemisphere is almost kind of like it's the expressive end of things, and I forget what verse it is, but Paul calls Jesus the express image of the Godhead bodily. I believe it's in Colossians. Is that
You're
right?
mixing Colossians and Hebrews 1:3.
Right.
You're mixing
Yes, I am.
Colossians 1,
Yes.
15 through 18 and Hebrews 1:3.
Right. Who is the express image of God? Yeah. Something like that. That is interesting. I've always seen the emissary as like the one who, there's also in I forget, in the Gospel of John, but it's that he tells the Jews that I have proceeded out from the Father. Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like he's this extension that comes back and offers something back to the Father, which is that he gives himself as a free will, his life as a free will offering to something. He sacrificed his own self for something and to something, so the return that's kind of like the properly patterned proceeding and expression of the motives and kind of charge that the right hemisphere gives, and then the return of the emissary is just as important as the orientation of its extension out. The return is just as important.
So it's the fact that Jesus ascended back up to the Father, the fact that he died and ascended back up to the Father is absolutely necessary for the narrative to be right.
Which
has to go back to the Father.
Which is in Ephesians Ephesians 3, that he that descended was him that ascended as well. Like that whole flow and interchange, that it's a movement. It's like a movement of spirit. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Ephesians 4:8 through 4:8 through 10, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
If wherefore he saith, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men. Now that he ascended, what is it but that he also descended first into the lower parts of the earth? He that descended is the same also that ascended far above all heavens, that he might fill all things. So that just like the left hemisphere, there's a requirement to descend and then ascend, and it has to be that way. So this idea that Christ could have set up his kingdom and everything there on earth, even after he resurrected, he could have just stayed there, but that misses the point. And so it's almost like just understanding the left and right hemisphere of the brain is a microcosmic metaphysics of the narrative of the Bible.
Yes. Yeah. It's like exactly. It's like another way to understand how the Bible is a medium by which you can understand how to be a human being who is in proper relationship to reality, making it a true document. It is true because of that.
Yes. And truth being process, not object.
Right. He that doeth truth cometh to the light.
Yes. Wow. How did all that pop out of what we were saying? My mother is in the chat. Hello, Mother. It's good to see you. Wow. Yeah, Adrian's in the chat too. Got Seraphim in there, and some other folks as well. He says Jesus' ascension was also necessary so that the church, inspired by the Holy Spirit, could come up on the scene as his parousia. So that's interesting. How far does the analogy go?
Well, so I don't want to be dismissive, but I also don't want to get too hung up on the contents of or the factualities of things and lose sight of like sort of the process and the pattern which we kind of traced. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So more so just like noticing the pattern of extending out with proper orientation, and then keeping oneself in proper faith relationship, which is like so that when the return is there, that the return is with fidelity, and with also with, with transformation, right? Because you have some new information, right? That you are processing back in some way, in offering, so I want to use the more ambiguous and abstract language, and not get caught up in the particular facts or ontological
The particularities of
interpretations of the
analogy.
Bible, because we it's such a pitfall for us. It's such a pitfall to fall into the ontological factoids of scripture, and therefore lose sight. It's almost like that in itself is an improper interpretation, because it's foregoing the bigger pattern that the right hemisphere would have you bring it back to,
So yeah, I want to double click on that bring it back concept with this. What we really want to do is hone it into, how do I live this pattern? How do I live this pattern? And there's an instance of a particular Jesus of Nazareth being the particular, descending and then ascending. The left hemisphere descends into the world, comprehends, and then brings it back to the right hemisphere. So if Jesus Christ is from old, from everlasting, and the Father, he says, no man cometh to the Father but by me. We tend to think no man gets to heaven except through Jesus Christ.
Right. That this has to do with the process of salvation or something like that.
Right. Exactly. So it's not like that. It's actually more like there is a dispatching and a receiving of the Father that requires particularity,
specificity, articulation, specific word that means a specific thing. It points to a specific thing.
It is instance based. It is individual interface based at any particular time, but the Father that is being interfaced with is not particular. Right. See, it is not bound to the particular. So it's an interesting thing that the access point to the unparticular is the particular. And that's what they call the scandal of the particular. Like, to understand the thing that is Christ, the thing that is from old, from everlasting, the Father up in heaven, and we worship him, and God is a spirit, and we worship him in spirit and in truth. What is this thing? It's almost impossible to know, but through a series of particular interfaces of being dispatched by the Father and returning to the Father through particularities, we come to realize, well, that's where the heresy really comes in. I mean, Jesus said, I and the Father are one. And he prayed in John 17 that we would be one, that the whole world would be one with him, that the world might believe that thou hast sent me. In other words, to word that a different way, it's not just that Jesus came from God, but that he is just a particular of something much larger and something much bigger.
Right, because if you're really paying attention and you're really honest, there are people who were purportedly walking the pattern of Christ before Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes.
So how there were people who maybe not in the same holistic way, or maybe not in the same particular way.
Right. A different particular, being dispatched and returning back to the same Father.
However, that pattern is eternal, is from
pattern's
everlasting to everlasting. And
Right.
how do I know that's true? Because it emanates out of any particular instance of itself. Like, I just think of Socrates.
You could think of Socrates, or you could think of Joseph or Daniel,
right.
dispatched by the Father, returning to the Father. Elijah, Enoch. And the scandalous thing from a Christian perspective is to start naming names outside the Bible,
Right.
who also met the pattern. That's the big no-no. To say that perhaps Socrates was also a picture of this pattern, that's the big no-no.
That's part of the cocoon, though.
Yeah, the fact that it's another paranoia against that kind of thing.
But it hinders you from seeing the greater glory of the pattern that Roberta was so eloquently pointing out, that it's almost like our bodies and our minds are like almost geared to experience it this way. So why does this cocoon that's been constructed, this fundamentalist cocoon that's been constructed so deeply, why does it repress that that intuition, or that kind of compulsion to experience the world in this way?
Why does it? Why does it venerate the idea of staying in the cave looking at the shadows?
Right.
If you think about even just the name fundamentalist, they sticking to these fundamentals, these sets of propositions, these structures. I've been thinking through over the last couple of days from the perspective of being inside the cocoon. And I liked in one of your last videos, it talked, the one that was the email, and that statement felt like I was crazy.
Yeah.
Like whenever you try to articulate something where in your gut you feel it's there, but you don't know how to make words, and so you try to structure words, but then those words aren't structured exactly right, and you kind of get shot down or persecuted. No, you need to say it this way, cuts everything off.
Right.
Yeah, and it's where you're trying to explore this thing, you're trying to feel your way through this to find out, hey, what is reality? And these rigid sets of fundamental or structures are pushed in on you.
Those boundaries,
or and those could be outward imposed or put on somebody, but I think we obviously all bring our own too. We self-impose a lot. Rohr in his book, I was reading through that last night. The human ego prefers anything, just about anything, to falling or failing or changing or dying. The ego is that part of you that loves the status quo, even when it's not working. It attaches to the past and the present and fears the future.
Wow. That's right. Which book is that? Was that from Falling Upward?
Yeah, Falling Upward. Early on.
Yeah. Wow.
That's such a wow. I've never thought of that. Like the ego is the thing the part of you that feeds off of the past only. And it's like the self has the potential to actually cast itself into the future and tug the ego along. That sacred second self is the thing that can almost like pull the ego out from the repression that it's like, throbbing with. You know what I'm saying? That's how I'm visualizing the different parts of the ego and the self, because of what John said. Like the potential of the future is reserved for the self and not for the ego.
Wow.
Like that almost in some ways feels like it puts a proper relationship between the ego and the self. For me, that helps me understand myself a little bit better in the future.
Yeah,
And
I almost,
my ego feels like it's being kind of pulled a little bit, like like a rubber band kind of flexed a little bit so that it has a greater bandwidth to
so
consideration.
I almost imagine your future self kind of dragging your egoic self around in its little shell, and each time you hit a bump, it cracks a little bit off the shell.
Mm,
So, uh, something like that.
hmm.
Got to take a coughing break. Not a coffee break. Coughing break.
Hmm. Hmm. It's kind of crazy that how the ecology of practice is like just having a genuine dialogue or a genuine discussion, how that I don't understand it. It invokes insight.
Yes.
Even if I'm wrong, I see the world in a very different way
Yes.
just because of
Yes.
that moment. My perspective has the ability now to see something in a different light, where the ecology of practices of just like studying the Bible and listening to somebody's monologue and commentary about this verse by verse by verse by verse by verse almost hardens the shell of the cocoon that I'm in, you
Yeah.
know?
Speaking of that, I'm planning on doing something on the Kabbalah, and I was listening to Chuck Missler's talk about the Kabbalah, and he kind of has a mixed bag on it where he presents like we are indebted to the Kabbalists for learning all kinds of insights, but at the same time, and then he mentions all these bad things, and he spends the last part of the second video, like several minutes, going over all these wonderful things that Jesus Christ is, as if the Kabbalah is against those things or Kabbalists are against those things, which I think is a misnomer. But what he's doing there, he's listing all these things in the guise of, as opposed to the Kabbalah, Christ is all these things.
Hmm.
In other words, what he's doing is he's hardening the shell of the cocoon. He's reaffirming all the ear-tickling things that people want to hear. Because what people want when they go to a Christian channel typically these days, they don't want to be challenged, they don't want to have to discern, they don't want to have to think. They want what they already think is true to be reinforced in a newly clever way.
Hmm.
That's what they want. And it makes them feel more certain and more assured. They don't want to be put in the place of uncertainty or questioning. And so that's kind of how he wraps things up by throwing all these certainties out there.
Hmm.
Just rehardening that cocoon.
When you said like he's the Kabbalist or a particular individual is against this, that, or the other thing, it kind of made me think to myself, I don't think I'm against any kind of facts. Like, I don't even think I don't think I would hear a fact or a proposition and be like, oh, I'm against that. What I think I'm against is like motives and like why something is being said. So I kind of feel like I could have anybody say something to me, a Kabbalist espouse some kind of fact, and my first initial reaction is not to be against the fact. It's like it feels like a waste of interpretive energy or processing capacity to focus on the contents and be against it or for it.
Yeah.
Where it's like I want to be like Charity and believe all things. And like believe all things meaning committed to the motive or to notice some kind of resentment or something and be against that.
Yeah, like you notice that the person is up to sophistry
Yes.
or they're trying to bolster some kind of resentful attitude,
I'm
or
against sophistry. I really
or
am.
pigeonhole. Yeah, you can be soft. Yeah, you're against the process of sophistry.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I know what its motive is.
Yes.
Yeah, their ego is playing in. Kevin, one of your videos, you had those 4 egos: perfectionism, pleasing, protecting, and proving.
Yep.
And when you collide into those, that would play into what you're saying, Nick.
Mm.
Trying to find that. Find that video. Find those slides.
You're
have
clashing with their ego. Which is James 4:1. What is it that causes fights and quarrels among you? Is it not this? Your passions are at war within you. Your ego.
Right.
It's not. It's the issue's not.
It's not your facts.
It's the issue's not the other person. The issue is the passions are not among you, but within you. Perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Pharisees want to squibble with Jesus all the time about the facts of the law, and he always questions their motive. Why are you coming up to me and asking me this question?
Yeah, that's right. It's that motives have a lot to do with that. And you'll notice if.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead, Roberta.
No, it just brought up a thought to me. I'm really ignorant on this point. If we were successfully able to push our ego totally out of the way in response to the world around us, would that leave us totally defenseless? I mean, would we be able to cope with the world in truth if our ego was totally pushed out of the way? Because how much of our knowledge and discernment is tied up in that ego?
So I think it's a really good question, and a lot of those terms would have to be defined. But I think that most mature people who are dealing with the ego would not say that you can ever completely get it out of the way, because it is still the modicum with which you mediate the societal world. It's necessary in that sense. But I'm also prone to say that it's not so much the ego, if in proper relationship to the genuine self, could be used to deliver answers that were in service to what is real rather than what is in service to the ego. And as wisdom, like knowledge is an addition of things, and wisdom tends to be a chipping away of things. And you'll notice that Jesus, he doesn't necessarily always just make statements. He'll ask some kind of crazy question that causes people to realize that they don't know, they don't have figured out something that they thought they did, to put them in a state of uncertainty. If Jesus is the son of David, why does David call him Lord? They're like, he's chipping away. He's chipping away. He's not giving them new information. He's chipping something away. Why callest thou me good? There's none good but God. He's chipping away. And so your ego would love to be called good.
Yeah.
Dear Roberta, you're so good. Your ego would love that. But your Christian trained ego would know that you're supposed to reject that. So you would secretly enjoy it while saying, oh, I'm not good. But then your true self, and I'm not talking just about you personally, but people would do that. Any Calvinist would do that. But you would be able to answer in service.
Are you equating me to a Calvinist?
Worse than that.
Is that what I just heard?
Worse than that. Knee high to a Calvinist. No. I think that ego and proper relationship would enable you to answer to something in service to something higher and better and truthful. The earnestness would be there. The earnestness oriented toward that which is real and true, would shine through in your answer rather than that which aggrandizes the ego.
So it's not divesting yourself of ego, it's putting it in its proper place.
Yes, almost like an emissary. It needs to be in its proper
Almost.
place.
Yeah.
It interfaces with the world, then it comes back and puts things back to the true
Yep.
self.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Seraphim says the ego was created by God as a catalyst for our theosis, and that's just like the cocoon is a necessary container so that you can see the butterfly. It's the same concept using different words. The ego is the container, more or less. You know, we've heard from everybody but Billy so far. What's going on, Billy?
Just taking it in, listening.
We're having a moment of aporia here, I believe.
Yes, I was just thinking that.
Yeah, lots of things being said where I'm just stopping. I just gotta listen. There's a channel I follow that describes, this is Lolosaurus Rex in the comments. There's a channel I follow that describes this process as being the rider on an elephant and learning how to control the elephant more and more. And that is the same analysis that Jonathan Haidt uses in his book called The Righteous Mind, why good people disagree on politics and religion, which I think is a very good book.
It is a good book.
The elephant and the rider. The elephant makes the decision and the rider thinks that it did, but it really did not. But yeah, that's a good thing to bring up. It's also compared to the metaphor, the ego is the driver of the chariot, but not the master. And Seraphim recommends a lovely little animated film called The Master and the Carriage. And Nick S. Snuffleupagus says, to be egocentric is to live on a cocoon. I am more than I understand. To be the one I am is to be the one I am becoming. So, and Zach Stein says, and this is not in the comments, but I love this. He says your second self is an inexhaustible resource of identity construction. And I love the way that is said. And he says, I remain myself by changing. It's interesting. So you're constantly becoming yourself. What other thoughts do we have out there? What y'all think of the video with Alana coming on?
I kind of want to know how you felt about it.
Yeah.
Not to put it back on you, but
I felt like it was a very interesting case in point. And by the way, the dialogue between me and her is ongoing. And so I'm trying to make sure that I'm not divulging things that she tells me in private conversations that she has between people that she doesn't necessarily want to announce in public. And I understand that completely. But it's a very interesting thing from a growth perspective, because I kind of really don't care about the concept of Calvinism anymore. Personally, it was more or less a container for me to get to the bottom of some other things in cognitive science, to realize some bigger, broader things. And so for that, I am thankful for the little struggle. But coming out of Calvinism and having little one-line zingers for why you think Calvinism is wrong isn't really the point. It's the interactive behavior and what kind of growth is occurring in the midst of this, and is this suffering from which a person will emerge more transformed or more hardened, So I'm very curious about this as it is still fresh and still in motion.
Yeah.
And where does a person go from here? And something that's occurring to me is that the mindset of having propositional beliefs, like when they come out of Calvinism, they do this fungible thing. It's like you have a car and you have a bunch of interchangeable parts, and maybe you upgrade the alternator and you upgrade the fuel tank and you upgrade the engine, so you go from a V6 to a V8, and then you put a super, you see what I'm saying? So you have all these interchangeable parts, and you're making this newer and better thing, but it's still a car. And what we're trying to do is get you in a plane, you know, and you can't get to a plane by building a great car. So when I see people coming out of Calvinism and they start to do these fungible replacements of one belief for another, like I'm going from limited atonement to universal atonement. You're supercharging your car. It's a faster car. It's a better car. It's still not a plane. It's like, and I'm not trying to make an assessment of where Alana is necessarily per se, but that's something that's standing out to me, is that kind of thing.
Yeah, you're pointing out a pattern with somebody who, I'll just use the rubric of the stages of faith, somebody who may be transitioning a stage of faith, and just pointing at a pattern that you're noticing with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so I kind of want to poke around as much as I can to see what oozes out of the semi-permeable membrane that we will learn its relevance later. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, because I mean, I haven't said this publicly, I don't think, but I don't think that I've ever met anybody or am aware of anybody who has the capacity and altruistic motive that you do to undertake the pretty much impossible task of like transitioning people, almost forcing people to transition out of fundamentalism and into a higher way of maturity, or a higher a more meaningful life. Let me just say it that way. A more meaningful life that is not cocooned by fundamentalism.
Yeah,
I don't see anybody doing that.
Yeah, it's easy to be on the outside of fundamentalist Christianity and just other them. But when you've been one, and when your previous in groups are succumbing to the meaning crisis, they're drinking themselves stupid, they're committing suicide. Obviously, that way of life is not good, and something needs to be done.
Yep.
And one thing that I've, back to the Alana video, and not just that, but also the video of the email that I got, what I'm noticing is that as people are transitioning, there's a lot of gaslighting going on that's very analogous to battered wife syndrome, battered spouse syndrome, to where as you start to leave Calvinism, they will make all kinds of demands of you, and make you think that everything is your fault. Like the church is having problems now, and it's your fault. And then they will even say, like, these kinds of people have been asked, like, whatever, appreciate whatever you're going through, please keep it to yourself and don't talk to anybody about it. They will say that, and people feel guilted into agreeing and complying with that. But speaking is, in a way, all that we have. What were you saying, Roberta?
I said, even though it's all predetermined.
Yeah. But when the person's coming out of Calvinism, to ask them, from the Calvinist
they can't have it both ways, but they do.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Why would I ask somebody not to say something God has predetermined me to say? But they'll capitulate. They will agree not to say certain things and not to talk about certain things, that is the biggest crime. What
Well, that's also a manipulation technique
absolutely.
in order to pigeonhole the individual into a sense of solitude. Like there's nobody really, this needs to be a secret and you need to keep it to yourself because there's nobody else that's going through this. You know, you're going through this because you're a rarity. Like it's your struggle with it. There's
You
nobody
don't
else
want to be
that's going
disruptive to the rest of the body and cause
Yeah.
division.
right.
You need-
Well,
Exactly.
it's just like an abuser grooming their
It
victim.
is exactly right. Is exactly like that.
You need
That's
to stay
exactly
in
what
your,
it is.
you need to stay in your cocoon.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
And about talking, didn't Jordan Peterson say we have to talk in order to think or something?
We have
like
to,
that?
yeah, you have to speak
Hmm.
truth in order to turn chaos into habitable order. You have to do that.
Yep.
And that is the logos.
That is
And when
so
you
true. So true.
when you put the muzzle on, you're preventing growth. And when somebody agrees
Yep.
to keep the muzzle on, that you just agreed to not ever grow because you have to
Yeah.
talk, you have to get it out.
So, all of this talk about the cocoon and everything, it makes me think that this is definitely priming for another discussion, but there's the cocoon of Calvinism, which John just said, like it's the trying to keep you in the cocoon, but there's a cocoon within a cocoon within a cocoon, just like Jordan Peterson's maps of meaning, which are layered, a map within a map within a map within a map. Transformation takes place in the same layered kind of way. There's a cocoon within a cocoon that you are transforming into more like, you know, so to have like a very radical transformation would be to have a breakout of a very, very, very large like worldview kind of cocoon. And then
Right.
there's micro transformations, which would be breaking out of like the cocoon of, you know, maturing enough to you know, deal with a coworker or something on a particular day,
Right.
something
Right.
like that. So the cocoon notion and transformation notion is probably layered in the same fashion that Jordan Peterson is layering his maps of meaning, you know. So you've broken out of the cocoon of Calvinism, however you haven't broken out of the cocoon of ideological possession in general, which is why when you break out of
Right,
that
yes.
particular cocoon, you end up construing a whole nother ideological cocoon.
So the Calvinism wasn't the cocoon, it was a decoration on the cocoon, and
Of ideological possession.
proposition-centric ideological possession
Yeah.
was the cocoon. Whether
So-
you decorate it as provisionism or Calvinism doesn't really
Right.
matter.
So like provisionism is operating in the same ideological the same landscape of a cocoon
Yes.
of something else.
It's in the same terrain. They just decorate the trees differently.
Right.
Wow.
And I can think of, you know, like you were saying, different implementations or manifestations of ideological possession. I think of different implementations or manifestations of some of the ideas or the concepts that you, Kevin, have mentioned that non-Calvinists have picked up on, and they could come, you know, from ancient philosophy. I think of the perfection that I mentioned earlier. You know, there's the perfection of God, and then there's the perfection of God's creation, and then there's the perfection of what we're as Christians trying to do for God to please Him. And the idea that there's only one, there cannot be two different things that are equally perfect, you know, and that it doesn't make sense to me. You know, like if perfection is north and south, then you have the equator where you can travel thousands of miles east west and still be just as much on the equator as you were 1,000 miles before.
Yeah.
And I think of this idea of perfection, you know, coming from here's something else. It's coming from thousands of years ago, before we knew about hyperdimensional mathematics, for example. And I think of north, south, and east and west as 2 dimensions, you know, and a perfection is 1 dimension where you can travel a lot in a perpendicular orthogonal dimension and still stay dead on in that perfection dimension. And you know, you can have 3 dimensions, 4, 5 in math. You can have an infinite number of dimensions, and it just seems kind of amazing that theologians, are they not aware of this? You know, or I mean, it seems like they're going with philosophy from the Stone Age and not applying more recent, you know, mathematical insight to it. But you know, that's maybe another topic.
No, it's very interesting. If you listen, like Richard Rohr's stuff I've been reading and watching lately, he talks about the most recent advances of science and math are providing religious insights. They're helping us understand things the Bible says better than we've had the capacity for in the past.
You know, and something else comes to my mind about perfection, but tell me if you think it's off topic or we're short on time, and I'll skip it.
We are a little over time, but go ahead and you can go ahead.
Okay, well, one of the things about perfection was that if anything changes, it would have to be less than perfect. So God could never change. But if you think about a perfect piece of music, music is nothing but change. If there's no change, it would be 1 note, like, you know, bah,
Right.
or you
How
know,
was that again?
it would be 1 note, like do or re mi.
Yeah.
But even that's not true, because every note, like
The sustainment of it is a change.
yeah, exactly 440 hertz,
An
A
A.
below middle C on the piano.
Yep.
It's 440 times a second. It's changing.
Right.
So,
right.
Perfection defeats itself as a concept when applied to music.
It's true.
It-
Yeah.
it- so it's not really. I mean, there's no clear definition. It seems so subjective how you define perfection too. Anyway, that's all.
Yeah. I like that
Just a
concept.
thought.
Music is such a good place to exemplify a lot of the phenomena we see in the world.
Yeah.
It's
a
like
great
the
analog.
betweenness between things. Yeah. So we're after 8:30. It's time to wrap things up. Do we have any? And by the way, I appreciate all of you coming back on. We haven't done anything live in quite a while here, so I appreciate all of you being brave. Come on, John, is this your first time going live with us?
I think it came on live once real early on, like when you first started doing live streams.
Yeah.
That was a while ago.
Yeah. And then you came on mainly only when we were doing it offline, and now,
Yeah.
so it's good to see you here for the
Yeah.
live one. I really appreciate
you.
you guys making yourselves vulnerable to come out and have this discussion while we're live. So it means a lot. And I'm hoping that a lot of people will see this and be edified by what you have said and what we've discovered together. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
I feel very cocooned by you guys in a safe way.
The safe cocoon of FSI.
Oh, could I have one little thing to clarify. When I said
Yeah.
the perfection defeated itself when applied to music, I mean perfection in the sense of requiring no change. In that sense, it defeats itself. Okay.
Yes, that makes sense. Like, I am the Lord, I change not, which the context of that is just in the fact that the sons of Jacob aren't consumed. It doesn't mean that there is no flow or dynamism. All right, any other thoughts? All right. You guys are great. I really appreciate you. And look forward to next time.